The garden was in full bloom that evening, roses stretching high along the fences, their crimson petals glowing against the dimming sky, and yet the air felt heavy with something sour. Because in my family, beauty never meant peace. Beauty was always sharpened into a weapon. I stood on the stone path with the watering can in my hand, a task that should have been simple, but nothing in this house was ever simple. Veronica, my sister, 28, tall and regal like the queen she thought she was, moved with that arrogant sway that had been drilled into her since birth, a sway that told the world she deserved everything without lifting a finger. I was 25, and as always, I was the shadow to her shine. She plucked at the roses, her manicured fingers sliding along a stem, and then her eyes found me. "Do not touch the roses, Isabella," she hissed, her voice dripping with scorn. "They are too beautiful for someone like you." My chest tightened, but I managed to murmur, "They are just flowers, Veronica, not your trophies." Her eyes flashed like steel, and in one sharp movement, she snapped a branch straight from the bush, thorns jutting out, petals falling like drops of blood. Without hesitation, she whipped it across my face. The sting was instant, a hot line of fire from cheekbone to jaw, sharp enough to make my eyes water. My gasp only made her grin widen. She slashed again, the thorns grazing my arm, leaving angry welts that throbbed with heat. I stumbled back, but she pressed forward, striking again and again, each lash punctuated by her cruel laughter. The watering can dropped from my hand, clattering on the stones, water spilling across the path like another humiliation. "Get down, trash!" she sneered, and when I tried to shield myself with my arms, she shoved me hard, and I fell into the dirt gravel, biting into my palms. She crouched close, her perfume mixing with the metallic scent of roses and my own skin, and whispered beautiful things, "Hurt the ugly, and you are nothing but ugly." Her words stung worse than the scratches, branding me deeper than the welt rising on my face. I looked toward the porch, desperate for someone to stop it, and there was my mother. Margaret, 53, her hair styled perfectly, her hand wrapped around a crystal glass of red wine. She leaned against the railing, watching, not with concern, but with delight, her lips curved into a smirk. "Go on, Veronica." She called, her voice sharp, as the thorns themselves teach her what happens when trash thinks it can touch beauty. Show her that scars are the only thing she will ever earn. My stomach turned, my heart pounded in my ears. I managed to choke out, "Mom, please," but Margaret only laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that cracked through the air. From inside the house, my father. Gerald's voice boomed, not in defense but in irritation. "Keep it down out there. If she is crying, then she deserves it. Do not interrupt my show." He did not even bother to look out the window. My humiliation deepened worse than the pain, because there was no corner in this house where my suffering mattered. Veronica whipped the branch across my shoulder, another sting blossoming into a welt, and she laughed louder, drunk on her own power. Margaret clapped slowly, mocking applause, her wine swirling in the glass like it was a celebration. "Well done, Veronica. Maybe she will finally learn her place," she said, her eyes locked on me with cold approval. My sister stood taller, her chest rising, her cheeks flushed with triumph, her smirk stretching wide. "Look at you," she taunted. "Dirt on your dress, blood on your skin, tears in your eyes. You look exactly like what you are, worthless." I wanted to scream, to push her away, to fight back, but my body froze. The weight of years pressed me down. I had been broken so many times that silence felt safer than defiance. Neighbors glanced over their fences, eyes flickering with curiosity, but the moment they saw Margaret smiling and clapping, they looked away, unwilling to challenge the image of the perfect Monroe family. Their silence stung too. I lay trembling, roses crushed beneath me, petals scattered like torn paper, while Veronica stood above me holding the thorned branch like a scepter of dominance. She dropped it finally, the thorns still glistening, and crouched down so her lips were near my ear. "Remember this? Isabella Beauty Cuts, and you will never have it." Her breath was warm, her words cold. I could feel Margaret's eyes on me like knives, could hear Gerald turning the volume up on his television, dismissing me completely. The humiliation was complete body and soul stripped bare. That night, locked in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint red welt on my cheek in the mirror. It was not deep enough to bleed heavily, but it was angry and raw, and I knew it would fade into a pale scar that would never let me forget. I touched it with shaking fingers, the sting radiating into my bones, and all I could hear was Veronica's voice. Beautiful things hurt the ugly, and my mother's clap steady and approving. I wanted to hate just that moment, but memory played back every other time. Every time Veronica was praised for breathing while I was punished for existing. She brought home failing grades and they said she was stressed. I brought home straight A's and they told me to stop showing off. She wasted money and they said she deserved it. I saved money and they mocked me for trying. Every insult, every dismissal, every laugh converged into that welt on my face. The roses were not flowers anymore. They were proof. Proof that my family did not just ignore me, they enjoyed destroying me. As I sat in the dark, tears drying on my cheeks, a strange clarity grew inside me. Silence had always been my cage, but silence could also be sharpened. While they laughed, I memorized every word, every smirk, every cruel glance. The sting on my face burned, but beneath the burn there was something new. Not despair this time, but a spark, small and fierce. I whispered into the night, "They will regret this," and for the first time, I believed it. The Monroe house stood on the edge of an affluent Boston suburb, a white two-story home with polished shutters and an immaculate lawn that neighbors admired. But the beauty was only surface deep because inside those walls, cruelty was a currency and favoritism was the law. To the world, Margaret and Gerald were respected pillars, she with her practiced smile at every charity luncheon, he with his commanding presence at business dinners, but within the family, they were architects of division. From the time we were children, Veronica was crowned the Golden One. She was born 3 years before me, and I was told stories of how the nurses in the hospital gasped at her beauty, how people said she would break hearts, how Margaret swelled with pride, and Gerald boasted to his colleagues that his daughter would be a queen. By the time I came along, the applause had already been taken, and I was treated not as a second blessing, but as a shadow that should learn to stay out of the light. Veronica grew up surrounded by adoration. At 6, she was paraded around in frilly dresses at neighborhood parties while adults cooed over her smile. At 7, she won a small beauty pageant, and Margaret cried with joy, declaring that greatness was in her future. Gerald opened a bottle of champagne and told everyone his daughter was destined to rule the world. At the same age, I brought home a drawing from school, a picture of our family I had worked hard on, but Margaret barely glanced at it before pushing it aside to show off Veronica's pageant ribbon. From then on, the pattern was set. Every achievement of mine was minimized. Every failure of Veronica was excused. When Veronica got a C on her report card, Margaret said she was stressed too beautiful to waste her time on books, and Gerald laughed and called her his carefree princess. When I brought home straight A's, Margaret scolded me for showing off. Gerald muttered that desperate girls were never admired, and Veronica rolled her eyes and called me a try-hard. The hierarchy was clear. She was praised for breathing. I was punished for existing. The cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was subtle, like the way Margaret would compliment Veronica's hair, while ignoring mine, or how Gerald would buy Veronica new clothes for no reason, while telling me to wear hand-me-downs because nothing would ever make me shine anyway. Even when it came to birthdays, the divide showed. Veronica's 16th was a lavish party with a rented hall, sparkling decorations, and a car waiting in the driveway with a ribbon on top. My 16th was a cake from the grocery store and a lecture about how I should be grateful not to be a burden. In the neighborhood, people learned the script too. When they saw Margaret at the club, she would beam about Veronica's modeling auditions, her beauty, her endless potential. If they asked about me, she waved a hand and said I was bookish, quiet, nothing remarkable. Soon, neighbors began to echo it. They praised Veronica for her style, her charm, her laugh, while they told me politely that I must be proud of my sister. Pride was never for me only comparison. At school, the same story unfolded. Teachers who met my parents saw Margaret's dazzling smile and Gerald's firm handshake and treated Veronica like she could do no wrong. When I excelled in class, they looked surprised, as if they had expected nothing, as if my success was an accident. Veronica leaned into her role, strutting through the hallways with that confidence only constant praise can give. I trailed behind books clutched to my chest, learning to fold myself small. The injustice piled on year after year until it became routine. When Veronica wasted money on designer clothes, Margaret declared that she needed to look good to attract attention, that beauty was an investment. When I saved money from babysitting or part-time jobs, Margaret scoffed and said, "Why bother? Nothing you buy will ever make you glow." Gerald's cruelty was quieter but heavier. He rarely raised his voice, but every word landed like a stone. He would say, "Stop trying." "No one likes a girl who tries too hard," or he would mutter, while reading the paper, "Veronica will marry well. Isabella will end up behind a desk forgettable." Every time I wanted to protest, Margaret cut me off saying ugly girls should learn humility. Veronica laughed and called me Shadow. That word stuck. In public, we looked like a perfect family, smiling at church, posing for pictures at parties, waving from our porch on holidays, but behind closed doors, the roles were written in stone. Veronica was royalty. Margaret, her fan club president Gerald, her financier, and I was the shadow trailing behind their crown. Even the walls seemed to hold it. The pictures in the living room were of Veronica at pageants, Veronica at recitals, Veronica in red dresses. My photos were tucked into dusty albums hidden in drawers, as if evidence of my existence was an inconvenience. At night, when I lay in bed, the silence pressed heavy. I thought of running away, but I had no money, no place to go. I thought of shouting, but my voice always caught, knowing no one would believe me. In the eyes of the neighborhood, the Monroes were untouchable, a family of class, and I was just the quiet daughter. The injustice did not fade, it grew sharper as we got older. When Veronica failed half her college classes, Margaret insisted she was too busy with modeling. When I earned scholarships, Margaret sighed and said I should stop pretending to be something. Gerald paid Veronica's rent in the city, covered her shopping sprees, bailed her out when she overspent, all while telling me to fend for myself, saying it would build character. Each slight was another lash, even without the roses. By the time Veronica stood in that garden with the thorned branch in her hand, she was not just my sister. She was the embodiment of years of cruelty piled on my back. The strike across my face was not the beginning, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent in the shadow. And Margaret's laugh, Gerald's indifference, the neighbor's silence, all of it was part of the same script. It was not just one night. It was every year, every insult, every dismissal crystallized into that moment. For the first time, though, something in me shifted. As I stared at Veronica's flushed face and Margaret's approving smirk, I realized I was done being the shadow. I was not ready to fight yet, but somewhere deep inside, I felt the seed of resistance. The days after the rose branch attack blurred together, but the sting on my cheek never left. It was not a deep gash, only a raised welt that faded into a pale scar, but it was enough to remind me every time I looked in the mirror. Veronica noticed too. She would glance at the faint mark and smirk as if it were her signature carved into my skin. One evening, only a week later, she stood in the garden again, the sun slanting low behind her. She plucked another branch from the roses, the thorns catching the light. I froze on the steps, my body stiff, but she smiled like a predator. "Ready for your lesson, Isabella?" She taunted, and before I could react, she lashed it across my arm. The sting burned hot, and I jerked back my sleeve, catching on the thorns tearing fabric and skin. Margaret's voice came from the porch where she sipped her wine, calm and amused. "Do not let her forget Veronica's scars build character." My protest, a thin whispered "Mom, please," was cut off by Veronica's next strike. She pushed me backward, so I hit the stone path hard, my elbow scraping against the edge. My father's voice carried from inside without a glance. Gerald shouting that if I was crying, I deserved it, that he was tired of my interruptions. It was as if my pain was background noise to his comfort. The humiliation weighed more than the scratches. Veronica laughed louder each time, and Margaret nodded along like an approving judge. Even neighbors peeked over fences. Mrs. Carter from 2 houses down lingered long enough to see Veronica raise the branch, but when Margaret caught her eye and smiled that perfect hostess smile, the curtain dropped back into place. They all turned away, the silence of the neighborhood louder than the thorns cutting my skin. At school, my sleeve brushed against the welt on my arm, and Jessica, a friend who had noticed more than once, leaned close and whispered what happened to your arm. I forced a laugh and muttered something about a gardening accident because how could I explain the truth that my own sister beat me with roses while my mother applauded and my father dismissed me? No one would believe it, and worse, they might pity me. Pity was not what I wanted. I wanted power. But power felt impossibly far, so I sat quietly while whispers ran through the hallways about Veronica. How beautiful she was, how she had auditions, how she was destined for great things. No one asked about me except Jessica, and even she looked at me with that shadow of pity I hated. The pattern deepened at home. Veronica grew bolder, testing me in small ways. She would tap the thorned branch against the table while I ate, smirk when I flinched, then laugh and call me pathetic. Margaret would sip her coffee and murmur that ugly girls needed tough lessons. Gerald would grumble that he did not want to hear me whine. Every small lash, every shove, every word pressed heavier on my chest. The conflict exploded one Saturday when Veronica barged into my room without knocking. She held the rose branch like a baton and smacked it against my desk, scattering my books onto the floor. "Still pretending you are better than me with your studying," she sneered. "Guess what? No one cares about your grades. You will always be the ugly shadow." Margaret appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, a faint smile on her lips. "Do not waste too much time, Veronica," she said coolly. "Trash learns slow, but sometimes you have to beat lessons into them." My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would crack my ribs. Veronica raised the branch and slashed across my shoulder, the sting cutting through fabric, and I bit my lip until I tasted blood, rather than give her the satisfaction of a scream. She laughed, calling me weak, while Margaret's eyes glowed with approval. The humiliation layered on itself. Gerald shouted from downstairs, "Keep it down!" and the indifference in his tone told me he did not care what happened as long as the noise stopped. I stood frozen, my arms trembling, my books scattered, my skin burning. Veronica towered over me, triumphant, her grin wide, while Margaret nodded as if this violence was proof that the family order remained intact. I wanted to fight back, to grab the branch to push her away, but the weight of years of insults pressed me down. The sense of being trapped screamed inside my chest. Yet in the silence that followed and the sound of my own shallow breathing, something inside me shifted. Even as I trembled, I realized that every lash, every insult, every approving clap was not erasing me. It was engraving me. They thought they were beating me down, but they were leaving marks that I would never forget, marks I would one day use. The conflict in those days was not just bruises or welts. It was the constant message that I was nothing, that no one would help me, that neighbors would look away, that teachers would not see, that friends could not understand. It was isolation turned into performance, with my family as the actors and me as the target. And yet beneath the humiliation, a quiet spark of calculation grew. My silence, once weakness, was beginning to sharpen into something else. They could not see it, but I felt it growing with every strike. The scar on my face was faint, but it carried the weight of years, a thin, pale line that seemed to whisper every insult my family had ever carved into me. Whenever I looked in the mirror, I saw not only the welt Veronica had left, but the shadow of a childhood built on humiliation. Memories bled together, not as isolated events, but as a pattern so relentless it felt like a second skin. Veronica had always been held up like a trophy. I remembered her 16th birthday, the night the entire neighborhood was invited to a rented hall with chandeliers and a chocolate fountain, Margaret glowing in a gown, Gerald shaking hands with businessmen, and Veronica twirling in a sequined dress as they unveiled the brand new car parked outside with a red ribbon tied around the hood. The applause, the flashing cameras, the shrieks of her friends filled the air while I stood near the punch table holding a plastic cup invisible. A few months later, my own 16th birthday arrived, and there was no hall, no car, only a grocery store cake placed on the kitchen table with a single candle. Margaret muttering that I should be grateful. Gerald barely lifting his eyes from the television. That contrast seared into me more than the taste of stale frosting. The scar on my cheek became a symbol of that same imbalance. It told me daily that Veronica's failures would always be covered with ribbons while my successes were dismissed. I remembered one year in school when Veronica brought home a report card littered with C's and even a D. Margaret gasped and pressed a hand to her chest as if the world was unfair to her perfect daughter. She stroked Veronica's hair and whispered that she was under stress, that beautiful girls should not be burdened with academics, that she had other gifts. Gerald chuckled and called her his carefree princess. That same semester, I returned with straight A's and an award for academic excellence. I handed it to Margaret with pride, expecting at least a smile, but she frowned and said in a voice edged with disdain, "Stop showing off, Isabella. No one likes a desperate girl." Gerald barely glanced before muttering that brains without beauty meant nothing. Veronica sat at the table twirling her fork and smirked. The award meant nothing in that house. Another memory cut deeper than the rose thorns. Veronica came home from a shopping spree with bags of designer clothes she had bought with money she did not have. Margaret clapped her hands and declared that her daughter deserved to look stunning, that investing in beauty was investing in the future. Gerald sighed but handed over his credit card, telling her she was worth it. I, on the other hand, had been saving money from babysitting a careful stack of bills tucked into an envelope in my drawer. When Margaret found it, she laughed and said, "Why bother, Isabella? You could spend every cent and still never shine." Gerald added, "Save your money. You will need it when you are alone, because no one will ever support you." Their words stung worse than any thorn. I remembered the way Veronica sneered at me in the hallway when I carried books pressed to my chest. "Still pretending you are better because you read," she mocked while Margaret beamed at her as if insults were charms. I remembered nights lying in bed listening to the echo of laughter downstairs, Gerald's booming voice praising Veronica for something trivial, like her smile at a party, Margaret toasting to her future, and me staring at the ceiling with my pillow damp from silent tears. The scar on my face was not just recent. It was the outward proof of an inward truth I had lived since birth, that in this house I was not meant to bloom only to wither quietly in the shadow of the rose they adored. The humiliation was cumulative. Each insult built on the last, each dismissal stacked on my shoulders until standing straight felt like rebellion. Even in the community, the roles were cemented. At church, Margaret would parade Veronica, introducing her as her beautiful daughter, destined for greatness. When people asked about me, she waved her hand and said I was quiet, studious, nothing remarkable. Soon, neighbors began to echo it. They praised Veronica's looks, her charm, her laugh, and when they turned to me, they offered polite smiles laced with pity as if my role was predetermined. Teachers looked at me with surprise when I excelled as though success was an accident. The humiliation grew sharper in college years. Veronica failed half her classes and eventually dropped out, but Margaret announced at brunch that she had chosen to pursue modeling instead, that college was beneath her beauty. Gerald agreed and wrote another check. When I earned a scholarship, Margaret frowned and said it was nothing that desperate girls hid behind grades, and Gerald told me no man would ever admire me for books. Every triumph turned into a taunt, every scar a reminder that their praise was a currency I would never be allowed to earn. Even Veronica's cruelty was rewarded. When she cut my cheek with the rose branch, Margaret cheered, Gerald dismissed. Neighbors looked away, and Veronica glowed. It was not an accident, it was the script. The humiliation became the architecture of my life, each insult, another brick, each strike another nail. And yet, deep beneath the layers of pain, something hardened. The scar on my cheek itched when I touched it, but instead of only shame, I began to feel a strange determination. They wanted me erased, but scars are not erasures, they are records. Every time I caught Veronica's smug glance, every time Margaret praised her for nothing, every time Gerald dismissed me with a grunt, I thought of the scar. It would fade into a pale line, but it would never vanish, and neither would my memory. The humiliation was supposed to crush me, but instead, it became fuel. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the air outside was heavy with the smell of rain, and the sky was layered with gray clouds that seemed to press low over the Monroe house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, cereal in front of me, untouched, my arms crossed, my mind drifting toward the endless string of humiliations that had become the rhythm of my life. Veronica strutted in her heels, clicking against the tiles, her red lipstick a statement, her hair perfectly curled. She carried a rose plucked from the garden, twirling it between her fingers as if it were a prize. She stopped at the table, tilted her head, and smirked. "Does it still sting?" she asked softly, tapping the rose against her palm. Her eyes scanned the faint scar on my cheek, the scar she had placed there, and her grin widened. "Maybe next time I will take it across your face again." She added, her tone light, as if it were a joke. Margaret sat nearby with her coffee, not even looking up from her phone as she murmured, "Scars build character. Maybe it will make you useful." For years, I would have flinched, lowered my eyes, swallowed the pain until it knotted in my chest. But something in me shifted. Instead of shrinking, I raised my eyes and looked directly into Veronica's. The silence stretched long enough for her smirk to falter just a flicker before she covered it with a scoff. For the first time, I realized my silence could be something other than submission. It could be planning. That night, I closed my bedroom door, pulled out my phone, and opened the recording app. My hands trembled, but I pressed record anyway and whispered into the speaker everything that had happened. Every word, every insult, every strike. It felt like pulling thorns from my skin, each memory sharp but necessary. I began documenting every new humiliation. When Veronica called me worthless, I recorded it. When Margaret told her to beat lessons into me, I wrote it down in a notebook and photographed the scratches. When Gerald dismissed me as forgettable, I saved the audio of his booming voice from the hallway. Each piece was small, but together they began to look like evidence. The scar on my cheek was no longer just a mark of shame. It was a reminder to keep going, to gather, to prepare. At school, I still smiled faintly, still shrugged off questions about my arm or face, muttering about accidents. Outwardly, I played the same quiet shadow, but inwardly, I was building something. I stopped crying in my room. Instead, I listened to the recordings over and over, letting them harden me. Every cruel word from Margaret became fuel. Every taunt from Veronica became a spark. Every dismissive grunt from Gerald became proof. It was not easy. There were nights when despair clawed at me, when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I stared at the scar and thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was nothing. But in those moments, I pressed play and listened to their voices again. Beautiful things hurt the ugly. Scars build character. She deserves it. And with each replay, I reminded myself that this was not my truth. It was theirs, and I would one day make them answer for it. The turning point came one Saturday when Veronica barged into my room, holding the thorned branch like a scepter. She smacked it against my desk, scattering my books, and sneered, "Still pretending you are better than me with your studying. You will always be the ugly shadow." My heart pounded, but I stood slowly, my arms shaking, yet my voice steady as I said, "You think you are the rose, Veronica, but roses die when you rip them from the stem, and you have been ripping yourself apart all along." For the first time in my life, the words came out calm and even. Veronica's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing, and for a brief second I saw something I had never seen in her face before. Hesitation. Margaret's gaze sharpened, her lips curling, but even she seemed unsettled by the steadiness in my tone. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply stood there taller than I ever had, the scar burning on my cheek, but my spine straight. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. Veronica dropped the branch onto the floor and muttered something before leaving. Margaret followed, casting me a look filled with suspicion rather than triumph. That moment became the pivot. I realized I did not need to fight with fists or screams. I needed to endure, to gather, to wait. My silence had become strategy. From then on, I smiled faintly when they mocked me. I nodded when Margaret called me useless. I kept my voice even when Gerald told me I would end up forgotten. Outwardly, I looked broken, but inside, I was sharpening every word they gave me into a blade. At night, I hid my notebook under the loose floorboard pages filled with dates, quotes, and photos. My phone stored recordings labeled carefully. I no longer dreaded Veronica's strikes because each one became evidence. I no longer feared Margaret's venom because each word was fuel. Even Gerald's cold indifference became a reminder that when the reckoning came, it would not spare him either. The scar on my face faded into a pale line, but it remained visible enough for Veronica to glance at and smirk. Instead of shame, I met her smirk with stillness. Inside, I whispered, "Keep laughing, keep striking. You are planting the seeds of your own downfall." For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift slightly. I was still their scapegoat, still their punching bag, but I was no longer only a victim. I was a witness recording, remembering, waiting. And that realization was the spark that began to burn inside me, steady and unyielding. Silence became my mask, and strategy became my heartbeat. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still sat quietly at the kitchen table while Veronica twirled roses in her hands like trophies. I still listened to Margaret's lectures about how ugly girls should know their place. I still heard Gerald mutter that I would never amount to anything. To them, I was the same shadow, beaten down, humiliated, forgettable. But beneath the surface, I had begun to build. My first step was money. Every dollar mattered. I took on extra hours at the campus library shelving books until my arms ached, helping students print papers, fixing computers that groaned under deadlines. I picked up shifts at a coffee shop near the university brewing lattes until my fingers smelled permanently of espresso, smiling at strangers who did not know that behind the smile I was measuring each tip like it was gold. I hid the money in a savings account Margaret did not know existed, careful never to let them see a statement or a receipt. To the family, I was still broke, still dependent, still small. That illusion was important. The second step was knowledge. I threw myself into my business administration classes not as a desperate attempt to prove myself to Margaret or Gerald, but as preparation for escape. Every lecture about management, every case study on strategy, every late-night writing research papers felt like sharpening my tools. I studied harder than I ever had, not for their approval, but for my future. When Veronica mocked me for reading late into the night, I let her laugh. She thought it was proof of my desperation. She never realized it was proof of my preparation. The third step was evidence. My phone grew heavier with recordings. I captured Veronica sneering Margaret, gaslighting Gerald, dismissing. My notebook filled with dates and quotes, each page another layer of the foundation I was building. I kept them hidden beneath the floorboard under my bed, a secret archive of their cruelty. It gave me a strange sense of calm. Every insult that once crushed me now became fuel. Every strike that once left me trembling now became documentation. Even their laughter became less terrifying when I reminded myself it was evidence that would one day burn them. Outwardly, I played the role they expected. When Margaret called me useless, I nodded faintly. When Veronica bragged about her supposed modeling opportunities, I smiled politely. When Gerald told me I would die forgotten, I lowered my eyes and whispered nothing. They mistook my quiet for surrender, not realizing it was the silence of someone counting someone waiting. The hardest part was maintaining the mask. There were nights when I wanted to scream, when the weight of their scorn pressed so heavily that I curled up in bed with tears soaking my pillow. But then I would lift the floorboard and touch the notebook. I would replay a recording, Margaret's venom dripping in every syllable, Veronica's laughter sharp as broken glass, Gerald's dismissive grunt. I would whisper to myself that silence was no longer weakness, it was survival. The scar on my cheek reminded me each morning when I washed my face. It was not shame anymore, it was a reminder of the plan. I told myself every day that I was building a path they could not see, and one day they would choke on their own words. My mask convinced them. Margaret believed she had broken me completely. She bragged to her friends that she had taught me humility, that Veronica was the star while I was the shadow that knew its place. Gerald ignored me more than ever, content that I was too quiet to bother him. Veronica grew careless in her arrogance, mocking me more openly, striking me with words and sometimes with roses, never realizing she was planting seeds in my archive. The mask even convinced neighbors. They saw me walking home late from work with my head down and assumed I was the same quiet Isabella who had always faded behind Veronica's shine. No one suspected the truth, that each step I took was closer to freedom. I began to map out the timeline in my mind. Save enough money to move out, secure an internship at a reputable firm, graduate with honors, build a career strong enough to withstand the storm I knew would come when I finally left the Monroe house behind. Each stage was another rung on the ladder. It was not glamorous, it was not quick, but it was steady. That steadiness gave me a sense of power I had never felt before. The family still thought they had control. Margaret still smirked at me from across the table. Gerald still dismissed me with a wave of his hand. Veronica still strutted like a queen. They did not realize that their empire was hollow, that the shadow they mocked had already begun to step outside of it. One evening, while cleaning up at the coffee shop, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For the first time, I did not see only a victim. I saw someone with a plan, someone with fire in her chest, someone who would one day make them regret every word, every strike, every laugh. It startled me, but it also strengthened me. Silence was my cover, but strategy was my core. And while they laughed upstairs in the Monroe house, I was already building the day their laughter would turn to silence. The Monroe household had always been staged like a play. Veronica in the starring role, Margaret as her director, Gerald as her financier, and me as the shadow forced into silence. But even the best staged play begins to falter when the script stops working. The cracks appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but I saw them because I was watching. Veronica had always bragged about her modeling prospects, walking through the house in heels that clattered against the wood floors, holding her head high as if the cameras were already flashing. Margaret fed those dreams endlessly, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter was destined for greatness, that beauty like hers was rare and unstoppable. Gerald grumbled about the money but kept paying, too proud to contradict Margaret in public. For years they managed to keep up the illusion, but illusions are fragile when built on nothing but vanity. Word filtered through the neighborhood one spring that Veronica had been dropped from a casting call for a major brand. The excuse Margaret gave at the club was that Veronica had chosen to focus on better opportunities, but whispers carried different truths. People said she had failed to show up prepared, that she had been late, that her arrogance had rubbed casting directors the wrong way. Margaret dismissed the rumors, repeating her mantra that her daughter was too special to be overlooked. But I noticed Veronica's smirk tighten, her laugh forced. She stomped through the house with less grace, snapped more often, and drank wine in the evenings the way Margaret did. Soon, another rejection came. This time, the excuse was that the industry was too competitive, that beauty intimidated others, that people were jealous. Margaret parroted those lines, refusing to acknowledge the reality. Gerald's patience began to fray. I overheard him one night in the kitchen, his voice low but sharp, telling Margaret that he was tired of pouring money into Veronica's failures. Margaret shot back that he was ungrateful, that a father should support his daughter no matter what. Gerald slammed his hand on the counter and muttered that he was done funding her delusions. But of course, he paid again. Still, the bitterness in his tone was a new crack. Veronica, meanwhile, grew crueler. Her failures made her lash out harder at me, as if hurting me could restore her sense of control. She barged into my room more often, mocking my studying, calling me pathetic, jabbing me with words that no longer cut as deeply because I knew the truth behind them. Every insult from her mouth was evidence that she was unraveling. The neighborhood began to murmur too. At gatherings, I caught snippets of conversations, women whispering that Veronica looked tired, that her beauty seemed strained, that she had not achieved anything despite all the talk. When Margaret floated into the church luncheon wearing her pearls and boasting about Veronica's future, the polite smiles were thinner. Some neighbors nodded but exchanged glances behind her back. The pedestal Margaret had built for her golden child was beginning to wobble. Gerald felt it most. His reputation in the local business community was tied to the image of the perfect Monroe family. When Veronica stumbled when Margaret made excuses, his colleagues noticed. He was invited to fewer dinners, his phone buzzed less often with friendly calls. The club that once celebrated him started whispering instead. He still carried himself with arrogance, but I saw the frustration in the way he tossed his briefcase onto the table, the way he snapped at Margaret, the way his voice dripped with bitterness when Veronica asked for more money. These cracks did not erase the cruelty directed at me, but they shifted the air inside the house. For the first time, Margaret's voice had a tinge of desperation when she praised Veronica. Her laughter louder than before, as if trying to cover the doubt creeping in. Veronica's insults came sharper, her temper shorter because the world outside was no longer bowing to her. Gerald's indifference hardened into irritation not just toward me, but toward Margaret and Veronica too. I watched quietly, my mask in place, nodding when Margaret called me useless, smiling faintly when Veronica mocked me, lowering my eyes when Gerald dismissed me. Inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Not joy, not yet, but the sense that the balance of power was shifting. For years, I had been the one with cracks breaking under their weight. Now it was their turn. The scar on my cheek no longer felt like proof of my weakness. It felt like a reminder that time was on my side. Neighbors who once ignored me began to look twice. Jessica at school whispered that people were saying Veronica had failed another audition. I shrugged, pretending not to care, but inside, I cataloged every rumor. The Monroe name was losing its shine. Margaret fought harder to maintain appearances, hosting dinners with too much wine, wearing dresses too bright, telling stories too rehearsed. But gossip is relentless. The pedestal cracked further when a photographer who had once promised Veronica a spread in a magazine never called back. Margaret claimed it was because Veronica was too exclusive for small shoots. Gerald grumbled that it was a waste. Veronica slammed her door and stayed inside for hours. I listened through the walls, hearing her muffled sobs, her frustration, her rage. She came out later with her eyes red and her voice sharper, directing every ounce of anger at me, but it no longer landed the way it used to. I saw through it. She was not triumphant. She was drowning. Margaret clung to the image of the golden child, but even she could not silence the whispers in the neighborhood, the invitations that dried up the looks that shifted from admiration to pity. Gerald faced the quiet humiliation of being left out of conversations at the club, of being overlooked at meetings where once he had commanded attention. The cracks widened week by week. For the first time in my life, the Monroe family was not untouchable. They were vulnerable, and though I remained the shadow in their eyes, I knew I was the one watching, clearly waiting, planning. Their downfall had already begun. By the time I reached the final year of my degree, my double life had become second nature. At home, I was still the quiet shadow nodding at Margaret's lectures, shrinking when Gerald dismissed me, tolerating Veronica's jabs. But outside those walls, I was building something solid. My grades were high, my professors respected me, and I had quietly secured an internship at a prestigious Boston firm. It was the kind of opportunity Margaret and Gerald would have scoffed at if I told them, claiming I was desperate, but inside the firm, it meant everything. I worked late nights, pouring myself into projects, taking on more responsibility than anyone expected. My silence there was not weakness, it was focus. The managers noticed. One in particular, Mr. Fletcher, began giving me tasks above my role. I stayed calm, steady, and delivered results. While Margaret bragged about Veronica's fading auditions, while Gerald lamented his slipping reputation, I was being noticed for resilience and grit. When the internship ended, they offered me a position, not a low-level job, but a junior project lead. I accepted quietly, hiding the letter in my bag. That was the moment I knew the stage was coming. The company hosted an annual gala, a glittering evening where employees were encouraged to bring family to celebrate milestones. Mr. Fletcher asked if I wanted to invite mine. I hesitated, imagining their sneers, but then I realized this was the perfect moment. I would not hide my achievements. I would expose them. So I invited them, and as expected, they accepted with smug delight. Margaret's eyes sparkled as she imagined showing off to Boston elites. Gerald straightened his shoulders, eager to reclaim some shine. Veronica smirked, assuming my job was a trivial extension of their name. They believed they were being honored through me, not because of me. Their arrogance was the bait, and they walked right into it. The night of the gala, the city lights glittered like scattered stars across the Charles River. The hotel ballroom was dressed in gold and silver chandeliers glowing above tables draped in white. I arrived with my family trailing behind me like royalty entering a palace. Margaret wore her diamonds, Gerald his tailored suit, Veronica her flashiest red dress. They moved with smug pride, convinced this was their arena. I walked ahead, my scar faint, but present, my mask calm. As we entered, colleagues greeted me warmly. "Congratulations, Isabella," I heard again and again. Mr. Fletcher shook Gerald's hand politely, but turned quickly to me, praising my work, my leadership. Margaret blinked, her smile tightening. Veronica's painted grin stiffened. The applause and recognition did not drift toward them as they expected. It was directed at me. During the mingling, guests stopped me to talk about the project I had led, about how remarkable my results had been. Margaret tried to interject, mentioning Veronica's modeling, but the conversation slid past her like water. Gerald chuckled nervously, attempting to tie my achievements to the Monroe family name, but no one listened. Veronica stood with her glass, her eyes darting, her smirk cracking. The air shifted, and I felt the first wave of reversal. Then came the moment of the evening. The lights dimmed slightly, the stage lit up, and the CEO took the microphone. He began speaking about resilience, discipline, and vision. My chest tightened, but I kept my posture straight. He spoke of a young leader who had exceeded expectations, who had turned challenges into strength, who represented the future of the company. Then he said my name. Isabella Monroe, please come to the stage. Applause erupted, a wall of sound that filled the room. I walked forward, every step steady, the sound pounding in my ears. Behind me, Margaret froze, her smile draining of color. Gerald's face flushed red, his jaw tight. Veronica's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, crimson wine spreading across the white tablecloth like a stain. Gasps rippled, but the applause continued. I reached the stage and stood under the spotlight. The CEO spoke warmly about my work, about my ability to lead under pressure, about my contributions to major projects. He praised my determination, my discipline, my grit. The applause swelled again, deafening. I glanced at the crowd and found their faces. Margaret, pale, her diamonds glinting under the lights, but her pride shattered. Gerald, looking away, suddenly small in the crowd. Veronica shaking her red dress, no longer radiant but garish, her smirk gone. The humiliation that had once been mine was now theirs, and I savored it in silence. The CEO handed me the plaque, a gleaming symbol of recognition. I accepted it, and as the applause thundered, I whispered under my breath, "Trash can bloom brighter than roses." The words were for them, not the crowd, but I saw Margaret flinch as if she had heard. Gerald's shoulders slumped. Veronica muttered something inaudible, her face twisted. The evening carried on, but the shift was irreversible. Colleagues and executives congratulated me, shook my hand, asked about my future. Margaret tried to reclaim control, introducing herself loudly as my mother, but her voice sounded strained. Gerald attempted to boast, but the words fell flat. Veronica hovered silently, ignored. The spotlight belonged to me and me alone, and they were powerless to take it. Later, as we left, Margaret hissed under her breath, "What did you do to deserve this?" Gerald muttered that it must be a mistake. Veronica glared at me with eyes full of venom. But I walked ahead, steady, my plaque tucked under my arm, the scar on my cheek glowing faintly under the city lights. For years they had laughed while roses cut my skin. Now the world had seen me, had applauded me, had named me resilient, and they had been forced to stand in the shadows. The gala was not just a celebration. It was a reversal, a revelation. Their cruelty had built this moment. Their arrogance had delivered them here, and the humiliation they once delighted in had finally turned back on them. The gala had been a turning point, but the true destruction of the Monroe image unfolded in the weeks that followed. News of the event spread quickly through the firm and the community. Photos circulated online, colleagues posting about the evening, praising the young project lead who had impressed the CEO. My name appeared in newsletters, my picture on the company site, my story shared as an example of perseverance. I walked into work each morning, greeted with congratulations and respect. Meanwhile, Margaret, Gerald, and Veronica faced a new reality. They had never prepared for a reality where the pedestal they had built cracked beneath them and collapsed. Veronica felt it first. She had lived her life on whispers of beauty and promises of fame, but after the gala, the whispers changed. People no longer spoke of her modeling prospects with admiration, but with pity, shaking their heads at wasted chances and arrogance that had soured her opportunities. Invitations that once poured in for parties and social events dried up. Photographers who had strung her along stopped returning her calls. Even the local boutique that once begged her to model their clothes quietly replaced her with someone else. She raged in the house, slamming doors, screaming at Margaret, calling the world jealous. But deep down, she knew the truth. The moment I stood in that spotlight, the shadow had stepped forward and she was left behind. Margaret tried desperately to protect her golden child. She strutted into the country club with her diamonds flashing, declaring that her daughter was still destined for greatness, that the gala was nothing, that it was just business recognition, not true achievement. But the women who once flocked to her table now smiled politely and drifted away. They whispered to each other that Margaret had been wrong, that perhaps beauty was not everything, that maybe the Monroe family had been a show all along. Margaret returned home with her smile, cracking her wineglass filled higher each night, her words sharper when directed at me. She hissed that I had humiliated them, that I had stolen what was never mine. But her anger could not rebuild the pedestal that was already rubble. Gerald suffered in his own way. For years he had leaned on the Monroe image, boasting at the club, at business dinners and community meetings, that his family was untouchable. But after the gala, whispers spread among his colleagues too. They no longer looked at him as the proud father of a rising star like Veronica. They looked at him as the man who had dismissed the daughter who rose without him. Invitations to dinners dwindled. Meetings felt colder. And the worst cut came when the neighborhood council quietly removed him from his role. They told him it was a restructuring, but everyone knew it was reputation. Soon after the business club, he had flaunted membership and sent a polite letter that his presence was no longer required. The humiliation for him was sharper than any insult he had ever thrown at me. Gerald raged, pounding his fists on the table, muttering that ungrateful people had ruined him, glaring at me as if I had orchestrated it all. But his power had always been borrowed from an image, and once the image shattered, so did his influence. Inside the Monroe house, the atmosphere turned sourer than ever. Veronica sulked. Margaret snapped. Gerald brooded. Their anger turned inward, lashing at each other, blame bouncing from one to the other. Margaret scolded Gerald for not supporting Veronica enough. Gerald snarled that Margaret had filled her with delusions. Veronica screamed that both of them had ruined her life. And I sat quietly, the mask still in place, while their empire crumbled. Neighbors who once ignored my humiliation now nodded at me in the street, some even offering quiet words of congratulations. For years they had looked away, but now that the power balance shifted, they dared to acknowledge me. Margaret saw it and fumed. Gerald seethed. Veronica spat insults with less conviction. The shift was complete. The humiliation they had once forced on me had become their daily bread. My inbox overflowed with opportunities. Journalists reached out to write about young leaders in business. Invitations came from conferences, from panels, from community groups that once barely knew my name. I accepted quietly, stepping forward one stage at a time, each appearance another nail in the coffin of the Monroe illusion. The scar on my cheek caught the light in photos, faint but visible, a line that told a story few understood fully but many sensed. Veronica avoided mirrors. Margaret clung to her wineglass. Gerald stayed locked in his office with the blinds drawn. Their downfall was not a fiery explosion. It was a slow suffocation each day, stealing more of the air they had once breathed so easily. Margaret's friends stopped calling. Gerald's colleagues stopped inviting. Veronica's admirers stopped noticing. Their laughter, once sharp and constant, had died into bitter silence. They tried once to reclaim the stage. Margaret insisted on hosting a dinner, inviting what few acquaintances still tolerated her. She wore her finest gown, Veronica her brightest dress, Gerald his sharpest suit. But the evening was hollow. The guests were polite but distant, the conversations stiff. When my name came up, as it inevitably did, the compliments were for me, not them. Margaret's smile cracked. Veronica's hand clenched her glass so tightly it nearly shattered. Gerald forced a laugh that no one joined. The night ended in embarrassment, their last attempt at control slipping through their fingers. The consequences were now undeniable. Veronica's career was finished. Margaret's social circle evaporated. Gerald's influence collapsed. And me, the daughter they called Shadow, the girl they mocked as trash, stood in the light they had always denied me. I did not need to scream at them or drag them to their knees. The world had done it for me because truth always leaks through the cracks of lies. For the first time, I walked through the neighborhood without lowering my eyes. People waved, greeted me, some even stopped to ask about my work. Margaret glared from the porch. Gerald scowled from his office window. Veronica sulked in the shadows, but none of them spoke. They could not. Their humiliation was complete, their downfall visible to all. And I, the girl they thought would rot, had bloomed. When I finally moved out of the Monroe house, it was not with fanfare or anger, but with quiet determination. I carried only what I needed, clothes folded into a single suitcase, books stacked neatly into a box, my notebook of evidence hidden carefully in the bottom, and the plaque from the gala wrapped in a towel to protect it. I rented a small apartment in the city. Nothing glamorous, just a clean space with a lock on the door that only I possessed. For the first time in my life, I closed a door behind me and knew no one could barge in. No one could mock me. No one could slash me with roses or cut me with words. The silence inside those walls felt different. It was not the suffocating silence of humiliation, but the calming silence of freedom. I filled the space slowly, buying furniture piece by piece with the money I had saved. Each chair, each lamp, each mug was mine. I sat at my own table and ate meals without Margaret's sneers, without Gerald's grunts, without Veronica's smirks. I worked long hours at the firm, but they were hours I chose, hours that built my career, hours that stretched toward a future of my own design. My scar remained faint on my cheek, but in the mirror it no longer looked like a wound. It looked like a badge proof that I had survived. The Monroes, meanwhile, remained trapped in the house that had once been their stage. Margaret still wore her diamonds, but the sparkle did not reach her eyes. She sipped her wine on the porch, ignored by neighbors who once flocked to her. Gerald still sat in his office, but the calls that once kept him busy no longer came. The council had replaced him, the club had forgotten him, and he muttered to himself about betrayal while staring out the window at a world that had moved on. Veronica, still dressed in red, still painted her lips, but no cameras flashed, no auditions called, no admirers circled. She paced the halls like a ghost of her former self, lashing out at Margaret and Gerald, slamming doors, blaming everyone but herself. Their voices, once so sharp and certain, were now hollow echoes inside a shrinking world. I did not need to fight them anymore. Their downfall was inescapable. The community saw them for what they were, hollow and bitter. The humiliation they had poured into me now soaked into their own walls. I lived in peace, not perfect peace because scars do not vanish, but peace nonetheless. I decorated my apartment with small plants, even a rosebush in a pot by the window. I touched its petals, sometimes careful of the thorns, and whispered that I had survived them. I mentored younger interns at the firm, guiding them with the kindness I had never received. I accepted invitations to speak at panels, my voice steady as I shared lessons of resilience, without ever naming the cruelty that had shaped me. The recognition grew, but I carried it with quiet pride rather than arrogance. I remembered too well what arrogance had done to Veronica. Sometimes I passed the Monroe house at town events. Margaret avoided my eyes. Gerald looked away. Veronica muttered bitterly to anyone who would listen, but they never spoke directly to me. They could not. They knew the truth. The day they had laughed while roses cut my skin had been the day they planted the seeds of their own downfall. And now they were living in the garden of their consequences. My victory did not come from screaming at them or exacting revenge with fire. It came from silence, from steady endurance, from building a life they could not touch. The scar on my cheek remained visible enough for anyone observant to notice, but instead of shame, it carried power. When people asked, I simply smiled and said it was an old story, one that taught me resilience. I never spoke their names. I never gave them the recognition they craved. I let them fade into the background, into the shadow where they had once tried to bury me. And there, in that silence, was my triumph. I had bloomed brighter than the roses they worshipped, and their laughter had withered into dust. Looking back now, I understand that the scar on my cheek was never meant to destroy me. It was meant to remind me every single day that cruelty leaves marks, but those marks can become strength if you refuse to let them define your worth. My family believed they were carving me into silence, shaping me into nothing, but instead they were building the steel I needed to walk away. The truth about toxic families is that they survive on control, on convincing you that their laughter is truth and your pain is weakness. For years, I believed it, shrinking smaller and smaller until even my reflection felt like a stranger. But pain has a way of planting seeds. Every insult was water, every strike was sunlight, and eventually the seed grew into something they could not cut down. People often ask me if I hate them if I carry anger for Margaret, Gerald, and Veronica. The answer is complicated. Hatred would mean giving them space in my heart, and I will not waste my heart on them anymore. What I feel instead is a quiet recognition. They were architects of their own downfall. They built a pedestal so fragile it shattered the moment truth touched it. They laughed when roses cut my skin, but they never realized they were cutting the roots of their own pride. I used to imagine revenge as fire, as screaming in their faces, as exposing them in front of the world. But real revenge came differently. It came in the form of silence, in the form of living a life beyond their control. The greatest punishment for people who thrive on cruelty is to see the person they tried to erase succeed without them. That was the justice I carried. To those who hear my story, especially those who have lived through families that wounded instead of nurtured, I want you to know this truth. Your silence is not weakness unless you let it be. Silence can become a shield, a place to gather strength, a strategy. Enduring does not mean surrendering. It means waiting for the right moment to bloom. I know some of you carry scars too. Maybe they are visible like mine, a thin line across your skin that tells a story of pain. Or maybe they are invisible, hidden deep in your heart, where no one else can see but you feel every day. Both kinds matter. Both kinds are real, and both can become symbols of survival instead of shame. When I stood on that stage at the gala and heard applause that was meant for me alone, I did not hear only the voices of my colleagues. I heard the echo of every insult turned backward, every laugh reversed, every dismissal undone. I did not need to scream at my family or drag them down publicly. Life had done it for me. Their arrogance collapsed under its own weight. Their cruelty boomeranged back into their own walls. And me, the daughter they had called trash, had become proof that trash can bloom brighter than roses. Now I live in peace, not perfect peace because scars never vanish, but peace enough to know that I am not defined by what was done to me. I built my own life, my own table, my own path. I do not look back with longing. I do not look back with regret. I look back only to remind myself how far I have come. And when I look forward, I see something they never imagined for me. Freedom. For those listening, especially those who are older and may carry the weight of their own family wounds, I want you to hear this clearly. It is never too late to step out of the shadow. It is never too late to turn silence into strength. It is never too late to plant your own garden, one where roses do not cut but bloom freely. People like Margaret and Gerald and Veronica exist in many forms. They wear different names, different faces, but their power is always built on the same thing, convincing others they have none. Do not believe it. Even if you are bruised, even if you are scarred, even if you feel invisible, you still have the power to bloom. My scar is faint now, barely visible, unless you know where to look, but I never tried to cover it. I let it stay because it is not shameful. It is my reminder that survival is possible, that cruelty is not the final word, that dignity can rise from the most broken soil. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Cruelty plants thorns, but resilience grows flowers. Do not let anyone convince you that you are only the shadow. Do not let their laughter become your truth. Stand quietly if you must, endure silently if you must, but know that silence can transform into strategy, and strategy into freedom. And when the day comes that you finally bloom, the ones who mocked you will be left with nothing but the echo of their own downfall. I was once the girl who lay in the dirt while roses cut my skin and my family clapped. Now, I am the woman who walks past their porch in silence while the world applauds my resilience. That is the arc. That is the justice. That is the victory. And if it happened for me, it can happen for you too.